remind my colleagues to please silence all electronic devices at this time. Under admin matters, we do not have a closed session this evening. And due to the swearing-in ceremony, we have to be finished with this workshop by 4:30. Just a couple of brief announcements. We have a table for 8 at the Martin Luther King breakfast on January 21st. And there are still two seats available. So please let Diane know if you'd like to attend that event. And she has details for where it's located and all that. Also, as I mentioned at our last workshop, Mr. Edwards will be moving to the 8:30 Discipline Committee in January, and the other committee assignments that Mrs. McLeod is vacating are open as well. So if you have an interest in any of those committees, please let Diane know. January is actually not a time for major changes to our committees, but obviously there will be some minor changes due to Mrs. McLeod leaving the board. Of course, Mrs. Hughes will fill in for some of those committees as well. Also, just a quick reminder that January 22nd is our retreat, and we are planning for a full day at TCC. And, well,
It's right here.
oh, it's going to be here? Oh, thank you. But we're still planning for pretty much a full day, and it'll be here. And then afterwards, at 3 o'clock, we will have a joint meeting with City Council that day, followed by our regular meeting at 4:30 here. Does anyone else have something for admin matters? Did I leave out anything? Double check. Oh, yes, there is one more thing. I have a slight revision to the textbook adoption committee. I'll pass these down. It's just a very slight. I think it went from 8 years, you'll see, to 7 years on the social studies, on the books for elementary social studies. Does anyone else have anything? Mrs. Rye?
I'll just quickly mention Friday's Top Chef competition at Old Donation School, or it was actually the culmination of, and you've all gotten the email, so in a nutshell, it was the first, second, and third place entries that were featured. Second and third place had their tables with the students, and we sampled their food, and the first place winning meal was served as the main lunch for the day. So it was just great to see all the enthusiasm, and thanks to Channel 13 for coming and helping to promote it.
Okay, any others? There was one other thing I just wanted to mention, that in the swearing-in ceremony, we're not actually sitting in our positions where we normally sit. It kind of goes by seniority, the way we sit, so your places will be a little bit different. And that's just kind of make it easier for people after they get sworn in to come back up on the stage. So, Dr. Spence, at this time, we're ready for our first workshop, but this afternoon.
Actually, Joel, did you want to introduce this? This is the legislative preview? Or does the other Joel want to introduce this? I was really talking about this Joel.
Joel that needs no introduction. No crosswires there. We're happy to have Joel Andrews with Transfer Consulting with us. Of course, everyone knows Joel. He's our man on the ground in Richmond. We talked earlier on his drive back from Richmond today after some very important announcements about proposed public education funding in Virginia. And he is here to give us a preview of the upcoming session, which is always very exciting. So welcome, Joel. We appreciate you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and give you sort of hopefully a flavor of what we think is going to happen this year, always with the caveat of sessions that tend to take its own path once you get into it. So things that you don't see as issues suddenly become issues when you get into January, and things you think will be big issues sometimes don't become big issues during January. But before we get into what I think might happen and what I think sessions will be about, just a recap of this past year and this past session, just to set a little bit of context. As I like to say, nothing happens in Richmond in a vacuum. One session impacts the next session, and certainly what we saw this past year with the budget and with redistricting is going to have a huge impact on sort of at least the climate heading into January. So as we all know, this was the first session for our new governor, Ralph Northam. It was also the first session for Kirk Cox as Speaker of the House. Kirk has been in the House for a long time, but this was the first session as Speaker. The previous Speaker had retired after being Speaker for, I think, about 15 years. The Democrats, as you all know, nearly took control back in November with everything coming down to the bowl and the names and the film canisters, right? The famous decision in Newport News with David Yancey. That really was the pathway for Medicaid expansion to finally get through Virginia. The previous governor had tried every single year for 4 years successfully. Governor Northam comes in, and the first thing he does is get Medicaid expansion through. So that is in the process. I've heard that they've got just about on track for the enrollees that they thought they were going to have happen. We also had a special session this year outside of the budget dealing with redistricting. And so there was really a lot of, I'd say, goodwill created this past session, particularly between House Republicans and the governor's office. As you might call the budget fight this past session was really between the House and the governor on one side and the Senate Republicans really on the other side. And so the House and the governor were pretty well getting along until we had to start talking about redistricting. And when we went into this redistricting section, the governor told House leadership, I'm not going to sign a redistricting bill, which created a lot of bad blood that had been already that between the House and the Senate. And so they left the special session with no bill. It went to the courts. The courts basically said we're going to sign a special master. And you maybe have seen last week the special master came out with the new districts in Virginia. And unless the Supreme Court intervenes, it looks like they'll be running in those new districts next year in 19. And then they would actually be running in new districts again in 2021 once the full redistricting is done and after the census. So it could be a really interesting couple of years. So there's a little bit of tension, I'd say, right now between House Republicans and the third floor of the Patrick Kinder building, the governor's office. So that remains to be seen, and that is probably not going to get a whole lot better, candidly, with session looming and certainly elections in 2019. We did finish last fiscal year with the surplus. It was about $550 million. All that money went to reserves. It went to the various reserve funds that they created. And this is all about, you might recall, the Virginia's bond rating. We've got put on the watch list because the bond rating agencies did not like how much Virginia had been taking out of the rainy day fund over the last couple of years. And so they've been a big effort to put money back into those reserve funds, and that actually the bond agencies are pretty happy with Virginia as of right now. So that's kind of what happened. So big picture of what we think is going to happen this coming session. So it's not technically a budget year. Last year was a budget year, so as you know, our budget is done on a biennial basis, so we're in the middle of that biennium. So technically Virginia does not have to pass a budget this year. We can have a budget bill for us, no amendments have to be made, and they can go home, unlike the last session, which is why they had to go into overtime. However, it's going to be a significant budget year. And we're going to talk a little bit more detail about that here in a minute, but budget's going to be a big focus. We also have a couple of big economic development projects you've probably heard about up in Northern Virginia. One is Amazon, one is Micron Technologies. So there's going to be deal packages on the table this session to help with those deals. The Amazon deal doesn't require any general funds because that's all paid with tax revenue generated by the project. The Micron package, I believe, does, so that will be part of the budget discussion. And then tax reform. Tax reform is going to be significant because that really impacts how much money they have to spend. And the two issues at hand are, one, federal tax reform conformity. So Virginia has always conformed with definitions to the federal tax code, which we have not yet done with the changes that have happened. The other issue that has happened is with a court decision out of, I believe it was North or South Dakota, dealing with Wayfair, having to do with internet sales taxes and Nexus. So this was an issue in Virginia a couple of years ago. The compromise a few years ago was you had to create some type of nexus in the state to collect sales tax, and now they've kind of loosened up some of those definitions, which could allow, if Virginia adopts it, about $150 to $200 million in additional sales tax revenue that could come in. The other thing that we're going to see, because we always see these heading to election years, are like brochure bills, as we like to call them. So these are the bills that pop up where, General Assembly members, they have a constituent that comes to them and say, will you put in the bill in this election year? So they're hesitant to tell anyone no. And so you see a whole bunch of stuff that comes up and they say, I had to put this in because, my neighbor friend had me put it in. So you see a whole bunch of stuff like that. It always makes for kind of interesting topics. And then obviously, just as I mentioned before, the new dynamics in the House with 51-49, how all that plays out, particularly after this whole redistricting fight and heading into an election year. I think what we'll see is things that maybe the House would not want to take votes on, they might try to push members to vote on. So things that would not really ordinarily make it to the floor might be on the floor just to get people on the board, and vice versa. There might be other issues out there that they might be happy to vote on in non-election years that they're going to try to figure out a way not to get put on the board on certain votes. So those are going to be all the political dynamics that are going to be happening in the House throughout the 46-day session. Other issues are going to deal with healthcare. Healthcare, I mean, we always deal with healthcare. Certificate of public need reform is something that we're going to be talking about. If, not pertinent to anything that we're doing. Balance billing, physician fees, cost of prescription drugs. These are things that are coming up over and over again. And then something you've probably heard about is gaming, particularly in Bristol, potentially in Hampton Roads. This is something that I think we will definitely see some legislation on, and how that impacts the session dynamics is going to be interesting. And then transportation, primarily related to the I-81 corridor. That's been the big focus right now with truck traffic's high incident rates. That corridor really needs to get fixed, and it's a significant cost to get it fixed. And so I think the General Assembly is going to be looking at options for that. Most of those are around tolls on trucks. Folks who are passing through. So, big picture on revenue and budget outlook. So we finished the current. We're ahead by about $600 million, which is good. So heading into the session, they have about $600 million to spend. That's the good news. The bad news is that there's about $900 million in sort of mandatory spending and priority spending that the General Assembly wants to do. A big chunk of that is a miscalculation in Medicaid projections, and that's about $462 million that they have to make up for in this current budget year. So that's going to be a significant portion of that $601 million. However,
Miscalculation.
the good news, yes, it was a miscalculation.
That's huge.
A significant miscalculation.
Yeah.
And it's not all that. There was also a couple unallowable costs for Catawba and Piedmont hospitals through CMS, things that they had billed CMS for that they're now not going to get reimbursed for. There's about $60 million of those, and a number of other things. But a big chunk of it was just a miscalculation in the Medicaid projections. The things that impact this, so that $601 million number does not include the conformity to the tax code, which is about a $574 million windfall to Virginia, and it does not include the internet sales tax. So if the General Assembly does adopt those things, that's about another $750 or so million that they'll have to spend. So these numbers are kind of a snapshot of where we currently are, and do not anticipate potential changes that the General Assembly may enact this session to get over those numbers. So it looks sort of doom and gloom, but it's not quite as terrible as it looks. But there are some things that they have to get through. I'm going to go to this slide first. Sorry, I got these out of order. All right, so I'm going to go to this slide first. So this is late breaking news from this morning. So the governor held a press conference this morning, and he released a few little tidbits that will be in his budget, which will come out fully next Tuesday. So next Tuesday, the governor will present his budget to the House and Senate money committees right before Christmas, and then everyone goes home and spends their holidays reading it. So the big first one is he put in an additional $88 million into teacher salaries beginning July 1 to get those salaries to a full 5%. So as you might recall, in the last General Assembly session, the governor and the General Assembly put in 2% raise to begin on July 1, 2019. This takes that 2% and moves it up to a full 5%, so it adds 3% into that. The other components, he puts in $35 million for an additional at-risk add-on. Then he puts in another $35 million for the lottery fund. So this is that fund that we've been receiving for a number of years that is the flexible fund, so we can spend it on whatever we want to spend it on. And then the other big one was $80 million to the literary fund for low interest rate school construction loans. So this is coming out of part of the discussion of we need more capital. It's obviously, if you look at the needs across the state, $80 million is a fraction of what is needed out there. There is, believe me, there's wide recognition that the need is much greater than that. But it was a one-time piece of money that they had, and this is where they wanted to spend it. So it will allow you to get low construction loans, assuming this goes through. So these are high-level proposals. We don't have all the details yet of these. We won't see them all until Tuesday, and then the General Assembly will grapple with them. The other thing that we've seen, and these are just kind of other high-level K-12 issues I think will have happen. There's a decrease across the state in ADM, so that actually becomes about a roughly $9 million savings to the state because that's ADM that was not realized. The House and the Senate and even the governor, they've been talking a lot about school safety. One of the proposals on the table is to decrease the school counselor ratio to 1 to 250. That cost is about $36 million. The increase the teacher membership fund. This is all about recruitment and retention. A lot of studies have shown that teachers get burned out early on, and the idea is if you can pair them with an older mentor, you can help with that retention problem. So they want to potentially put another $4 million in that program. These are, by the way, I would say these are not proposals that are currently on the table. These are things that are sort of being discussed generally. Implementation of the restraint and seclusion regulations that are coming out of the Board of Ed, I believe next year, I think is when they'll finally be adopted. The cost to implement that is probably a little more than $4 million, but the $4 million would cover the DOE's cost as well as potentially as well as training at the local level across the state. The House Select Committee in particular has been talking about funding more school resource officers, another $1.76 million to fund 44 of them. Special ed day placement, this is all about the CSA funding, particularly related to students who are on the autism spectrum and that range, because that student population is increasing at a higher rate than anywhere else. And so that CSA fund is increasing exponentially, and they're very concerned that it's increasing at a rate at which is unsustainable. So they are trying to get their arms around that. They've been talking about this for a couple of years now, but how to deal with it, because right now the state pays for those CSA funds. And then what are the other school safety initiatives that we might see? We've been talking a lot about the Select Committee of School Safety and what their work has been. I'll kind of go over a couple more of their recommendations, and then other priorities. Obviously, we've seen from the governor, teacher salaries is going to be a priority. What else might be the priorities of both the House and the Senate, and what else might come from the governor's office? Other issues that are unrelated to budget. So I'd call these the perennial issues, but some of these we haven't really seen over the last couple of years, in part because, certainly last year, because of the changes and the dynamics in the House that we were just talking about. So the Virginia virtual bill, we've not seen last year. I would not expect to see it again this year. Even if we do, I don't think it will pass. I don't think it will actually get out of the House, and I don't think it would even make it out of the House Education Committee. The Parental Choice Savings Account, another bill we've seen the last couple of years. We saw it last year. It didn't make it out of the House. I read an article recently about the patron who is now considering expanding the scope of this bill to now include when a child does not feel safe at school. So not only does it just, before it all had to do with special ed and IEPs and things like that, so he's kind of expanding the scope. I haven't seen the specific language on that. The bill hasn't come up on the system yet, but that's something that we'll have to watch. I'm not overly concerned because that bill has not made it out of the House the last couple of years, and even if it were by some chance, I don't believe the governor would sign that bill, but that's something that we will be watching and dealing with this year. School safety, school discipline, I think is going to be an issue, but in the context of school safety. So that's what we've been talking about a lot. There was a proposal that I think we'll see from potentially Delegate Mullen in Newport News dealing with the reporting of delinquencies and other things like that, and its connection to law enforcement. So I haven't seen the specific language on that, but that's something that we might be working on. And then workforce development is something that they talk about all the time, mainly related to CTE and preparing students to go into the workforce. New issues, school safety, which will be, I think, significant this session. The House Select Committee released 24 recommendations last month. The big ones out of that were really having to do with guidance counselors, trying to get guidance counselors back to counseling. The Senate is evaluating those same types of concerns and problems. Everyone is thinking about this from the perspective of when a student is in crisis, how do you provide services to that student to make sure it does not become a danger to that student or to other students in the building. I would think everyone has a different view of how those problems should be solved, so that is something that we'll be talking about at length this session. And then the governor has an announcement on Thursday, and his announcement is going to be his school safety plan. So we anxiously await to see what those discussions will be, and we have been engaged with both the Select Committee extensively. Dr. Spence came up and presented over the summer to that group. He also presented to the Senate Finance Committee last month about all the good work that you all have done. So you've really been a leader in this space in Virginia, and I think a lot of legislators have looked to us about what we have done, and that's been a great talking point for us. So I think we've had a lot to say in that conversation. The other school modernization subcommittee, this was led by Senator Bill Stanley, who went around the state talking about old schools and how to modernize old schools. They came out with a couple of recommendations. One is a referendum potentially that would dedicate this new internet sales tax towards school construction, particularly modernizing the old schools. I expect that we'll see that bill this year. I don't think anyone's not going to vote for a referendum on this issue, and I would imagine that if a referendum goes through, most of the population would vote that they should use this to fund schools. However, the details become after that all happens and what the General Assembly's action really becomes at that point once we get through that process. But it will be interesting to see how that conversation is now informed by the governor's announcement today about that $80 million for the Literary Fund. So last, quickly, the calendar. So as I mentioned, next week the governor will present his amendments to the biennial budget. Session is really just less than a month away. It's hard to believe. The last day to introduce bills will be January 18th, so that will be the day that we've really got a sense of everything that will be out there. February 10th is when the House and the Senate will present their amendments to the biennial budget. And then they'll have about 2 weeks there to figure it all out, and they'll adjourn on February 23rd. And I would not expect session to go over it all this year. We've gone over certainly when we have to pass a budget, but I would imagine they will get out on time and maybe even a push to get out early, particularly heading into election year. If they do this for a couple of reasons. One, they think they want to make sure everyone knows back home that they are it's good governance, that they can get done early with their work and go back home. And they also want to go back home and start knocking doors because November will be right around the corner. So they're anxious to get out of Richmond as quickly as they can. So happy to take any questions or any other comments. So thank you.
Do we have any questions or comments? Ms. McLeod?
Joel, I don't know if you can go more specifically, but the reducing the number of counselors and having a ratio, and that you presented that as a mental health and a safety issue. Do you what more can you tell us about that? Because I have a concern. We have our counselors, and then we have counselors.
That's correct. And so that the proposal that the House has been talking about is that counselors should spend 70% of their time counseling. I don't know what counseling means just yet. I assume it means spending time with students. There are some school divisions that will have counselors as testing coordinators and doing other things like that. What that does not address is that what you all have done in your work to show that guidance counselors are counseling, but when it comes to how they spend their time counseling, they're spending a lot of time on academic and career readiness and things like that. So I don't think that 70% factors in sort of that part of the discussion, which is very important because, and I think the other part of it is there are counselors who may be very qualified and very good at helping a child in crisis. There may be other counselors that are not comfortable in that role. And making sure we get the right people in the right role to address the problem as quickly and efficiently as possible is going to be very important. And so the conversation that we've been having is how do we get behavioralists and mental health professionals to be in that role to help those students, to help train teachers to do that type of work.
Making sure our delegates and senators understand the
That,
difference.
that's
and what's
exactly
really
right.
happening.
And having that flexibility that when we talk about getting more of those professionals into schools and into the classrooms to help with that, that there's flexibility at the local level to be able to address that need as a local school division may see fit. There may be a school division that says, look, I would love to have more counselors and we think this is going to address our problem. If that works for them, maybe that's fine. But I don't know if that's going to work for us or
It's
other
not
school
one
divisions.
size fits all.
That's correct. So that's the conversation we've been having.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Edwards?
Does the state currently fund any SROs, school resource officers?
They do. I don't remember the exact
I
number.
mean,
So
I don't
that-
think we
It's
get
a
any.
very small
it's a
number,
very
yeah.
small, and that number, that 1.76 million, only gets it to 44. And if
I mean, that's
it's
like
it's
nothing
But for school
statewide.
systems,
say
we
why,
can't
yes,
afford
it's
it.
we're not talking. This is going to be some great new number of SROs that are going to be either in Virginia Beach or elsewhere. So.
Well, and past that, part of the conversation we've been having is that, as you and I've talked about, our police department doesn't necessarily want more school resource officers. What we need are more security officers who are on a different
Level.
sort of level than what we have currently as security assistants. And so thinking that through.
Monitor.
Well, that's why
Right.
the language coming down would be important
Uh-huh.
to allow.
We've been pressing on that issue.
That's
for
one of
sure.
the conversations we want to having. Yeah.
That goes along with the counselor conversation, saying there's flexibility that needs to be there for these various types of positions based on local division needs.
Any other comments, concerns? Thank you, Joel.
All right,
We
thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next.
So this is another in our ongoing series of pre-budget discussions with you, just to talk about sort of where we are. And you just heard some initial news about budget, but Farrell will get into where we are this year, a little bit a reminder of the 5-year forecast, and then kind of a recall of some of the needs and priorities that have been discussed.
Thanks, Doug.
Chairwoman Anderson, Vice Chair Donald, School Board members, and Dr. Stent. Let me follow up Joel's presentation since he introduced what the governor is proposing. And just a couple of things to clarify. We've just gotten this information. I saw it about 10 or 15 minutes or so before I came down here and got a chance to read just the press release. But when he talks about the 5% pay increase, I want you to go back and remember a conversation this past year when the General Assembly approved a 3%. It didn't start until July of 19. And the state was going to give us 2 years to get access to that 3% from the state, meaning that we had 2 years to implement at least the 3% pay raise. Well, this year's pay raise was 2.4%. So to get that 3%, next year's budget, we only had to come up with 0.6%, okay, to make us whole to get that state money. Now, the governor's added 2%, which takes it to 5%. We've already complied with 2.4% of it. So next year's budget, we would have only had to budget 2.6% to get access to the full 5%. So that's just a clarification, because unless there's some specific language in the governor's proposal that takes away what the legislature intended, allowing school divisions 2 fiscal years to access that state money. I don't think that I'll find that when we do the full analysis. The other thing regarding the literary funds, where they're putting $80 million, Virginia Beach has very seldom accessed the state literary funds, primarily because the debt service, the interest rates that we've been able to get because of Virginia Beach's AAA bond rating, we've been able to access charter bonds at a lower rate actually than we could get the literary funds for. So that's one point. I think Great Neck Middle, we use some state literary funds to help fund that school. But these literary funds they're competitive in the state with regard to the poverty of the area. And in my view, I think it would be highly unlikely that we would be able to even access any of the $80 million given the need throughout the state. So just that point. And we'll do a full analysis of the governor's proposal when we get more information, and we'll share that with you as we do that. We're going to go through this fairly quickly. As Dr. Spence mentioned, we're going to cover a few things. This is a pre-budget. We're in the process now of developing next year's budget, and there was some dialogue that you had around the table this past budget year where some folks didn't feel like you had early enough an opportunity to express what you would like to see in the budget. So this is one of those opportunities for you to do that, and that we're into full-blown developing the budget for next year right now, and we'll be presenting the superintendent's estimate of needs that first Tuesday in February. So these showing on the slide are the things that are in the current year budget. We were able to accomplish a lot of things budgetarily in the current year budget, and that we were able to approve a 2.4% salary increase. You completed the funding of the unified scale. That's significant. It was a multi-year promise that you made. We completed the final funding of what we needed in the base budget for the 101 initiative. That's significant in itself. We were able to add a number of FTE positions, and you can see here from the list the big one being 28 positions to use strategically to reduce class size. And primarily it was in those high school classes that had over 150 students and daily, and middle school classes that had over 120. And you saw we were able to add an additional counselor at each high school, and you see what else is left on the list. We were also able to add 5 more school buses in the base budget. Ultimately, our goal is to have 50 of them in there. I think this takes us to about 40. Also some funding to meet some of the special ed mandates that we're required to do. Just as a reminder, you saw us give a briefing on the 5-year forecast. All of you got a copy of that full report. In the 5-year forecast, we're projecting out a salary increase next year. This is a current agreement between the city and the schools of at least a 3% salary increase for next year's budget for both city and school employees, and then a 2% for the remaining part of each year for the remaining part of the 5-year forecast. We built in each of the 3 years a 3% increase in the healthcare inflation. Over the last 2 years, we've been well below the nation's average in increased cost for healthcare. Well below actually the 3%. I think this past year it was right at 1%. So a number of the initiatives that we've made in the healthcare plan are really taking hold, I think. You see that we will also in the 5-year forecast, and I'm assuming your goal going forward is we would continue to implement the full-day kindergarten. This is our 2nd year. Next year will be the 3rd year. That means that next year's budget will be fully using all of the $6.75 million that we got from the city as additional tax increases. And I think our goal would be for the last few years after that, we would try to fund it within the resources that we have. We'll see how that goes. We built into the 5-year forecast, we'll likely build into next year's budget a 2.5% increase to those non-salary line items that will be hit with inflation. You've seen these budgetary goals and challenges in the past. We still have them. Obviously, program priorities that you choose to include in the budget for the next year that might have additional dollars, those will compete with dollars that we already have in the other priorities that we have budgetarily. Continuing efforts in technology. The one-on-one initiative, I think we have a base budget every year for that. That base budget will allow us to replace those technology devices as they age out in the future without having additional funds, because we would have them in the base budget. The ongoing need for competitive compensation for employees, employee benefits, any enhancements that we might have there. State and federal mandates, those are always an issue. We'll see what comes out of this year's legislative session to see if they have any unfunded mandates in the final legislative budget. As you know, the lagging state funding going back from basically just before 2009-10, it's pretty significant. It's for Virginia Beach through this past year, I think, on a per pupil basis, it's about a 5.9% decrease on a per pupil basis of state funding. School safety, that's a major initiative that you have going forward. And obviously the last one is the structurally flawed operating budget, and that's simply that we're still using one-time money to balance the budget. This year we're using $6.8 million of reversion funds to balance the budget. We're hoping to decrease that each year over the next few years until we get that down to zero. And finally, this is just for your reference, we still have unmet needs. We've tried to update these as quickly as we could over the last few days. There may be some other updates as you see the final version of the budget in February, but you all have a copy of this full presentation. And then we have some unmet needs in the technology area. So I just wanted to present you some food for thought, and hopefully that will generate some discussion. Dr. Spink, that's all I have for you.
Do we have any questions or comments? Any discussion on this at this time? Mr. Edwards?
The College Park. What
And
is it?
transportation network redesign?
Yeah.
I can speak to that briefly, and then if we're going to get into the technical details, I'm going to turn it over to the tech team.
Well,
But
I
the
mean,
short
if-
version is, it was built, these were new buildings that were built with new technology that Verizon no longer supports. And so we've got to go to a different layer of technology. What was the name, Ms. Ramesh? What was the name of that technology?
it was based on the fiber technology. They had it for a very short period of time, and they no longer are deploying that anywhere.
Okay, I think that's enough for now for me.
Wow.
Sad.
It is. Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Ms. Weems?
Thank you, Farrell. I would just like to add a couple things for my colleagues and the administration to consider. One would be, and I've had this discussion with Dr. Spence briefly, but some money allocated for expansion of more rigorous courses at the Renaissance Academy for when students are sent there and we don't offer 4 of their subjects, and it's usually the advanced courses. And with today's technology, hopefully we can do that, via Streamline, Virtual Virginia, FaceTime, anything with technology, because that's what we hear, parents coming and saying, it's going to ruin my child's academics because they've already taken all the math and now you don't have what they need. So I would like that to be on the table. Also, Ms. Manning and I visited the GED program over at the jail a couple weeks ago, and it's a very successful program. Outstanding pass rates, and we pay for the instructor there. And so when she does the GED program, then she administers the exam. If the inmate is released, they work with our adult learning center to get their GED. The problem is she's on a 10-month salary, and if she has anybody coming to her like in late April or May, she has to turn them down because it's not enough time for them to get their 12 weeks to get their GED. So I would like to consider to put that position in a 12-month instead of a 10-month position. That will be very low in cost. And personal space heaters for us that sit on the dais.
I think that might be a fire marshal issue. We'll check
And
into
down
it.
here at the table too.
Just a budget savings.
Just something that
Blankets for all.
Yes, 10 of us are freezing out there.
Exactly. Charting the course, police blankets, please.
Outside of the budget conversation, we did have some discussion about the availability of online coursework. And so if we know, and we'll work with Mike McGee as well, but if we know which courses the students need and the board's comfortable with authorizing within the current budget, we can pay for those courses. We have a program called Apex, and we can put those students onto this. And the thing about Apex is it's chunked out so they can come in and out of the class. So if they're not going to be there for a year, they're only going to be there for 6 weeks towards the end of the year, whatever. They can come in and out of it, and so we could likely leverage that technology to do that. So,
Excellent.
and I don't think we need to create a budget item for that one. We will certainly figure out how to get the other one into the budget.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. McLeod?
With technology the way it is, the consequence for the behavior is that they are now not at their home school.
Right.
And so by offering, just today using Blue Jeans and all the different GoToMeeting and different things like that distance learning opportunity where they are, to your point, if they go back in. So technology is just really advanced that we can do that. And so when you said we'll try to have the courses they need, but we don't always know. And when discipline hearings, when we're sitting there, that's a huge part of what we want to follow policy and we want to support our administrators. But a huge part of it is thinking about that. A part of it which isn't fair to the administrators and the other students when sometimes we just are worried about that part. Even if we just choose to send them to a different school, we don't necessarily know that that's not their neighborhood school. So that really would help in discipline committees being able to know that doesn't need to be part of the equation anymore.
Yeah. So one thing we'll do is we'll provide the discipline committees with a list of courses that are available
Okay.
and that can be available, so that when they say, well, I'm in, calculus BC, we can show you if that's available or not.
Okay.
That'd be great.
That's great.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald?
Thank you. Mr. Hunziker, budget man. In years previous, so we place some funds every year in CIP, right? And years previous, but what we know that is lagging in terms of comparing pre-recession, what was being able to invest and staying up with our improvement plan. for the board's consideration, administration's consideration, making sure we have an eye on that, I think is going to be important going forward. So go ahead, Steve.
Dr. Spence, you can talk about this if you want to, but I'm going to just say this. We have been working with the city for the last few months. Actually, we're meeting tomorrow morning with members of the city budget staff. They've helped us develop a program that will assist us and will assist you, the board, where we can go in and do some scenarios on funding the CIP going forward. You now have a new long-range building program report. We're going to use that, and we'll schedule some time in the next 6 weeks, I would assume,
So
to
we
go over,
already have.
use that program to show you, well, if we're going to need $60 million a year, this is what it's going to cost each year for 20 years, or 70 million, or 80 million, or whatever.
So the two pieces of that are the capacity, the debt capacity, right? And so looking at that with the city, and that's really what this conversation has been about. And then the scenarios, you remember in the long range study, you kind of saw the three scenarios of the 40, 60, 80.
Right.
And so looking, and so we could go higher, depending on the city's capacity. And so we could look at those scenarios, and that's really what we're talking about doing. We have scheduled a retreat with the city council, a joint retreat that was mentioned earlier, and that part of that will be this conversation about the CIP. So we will come back before the estimate of needs with the CIP conversation between you and city council. So in the interim, if you have specific thoughts about where you'd like to see us trying to get and what your priorities are around the long range plan that was presented to you this fall, if you would communicate those to us as we prepare the CIP, that would be most helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Edwards.
Well, there's the tail to that increased CIP funding, i.e. the interest, is an operating fund,
Correct.
takeout. So in addition to charter bond and authority and what we can do for the schools in terms of total school funding, that's obviously would fall into whenever we look at the formula, because the formula doesn't support much more interest, and we certainly need to get from 40 to 60 to hopefully 80. But the interest piece of that's got to be addressed at the same time.
That's a major issue that
No, I
you'll
understand.
be dealing with. Like, for example, right now we spend about, is it 41 or 43 million? Say $41 million in interest.
Yeah.
That's the debt service we've got every year. That comes right off the top of whatever the revenue sharing formula generates. Okay? If, for example, you wanted $60 million a year, and that $60 million a year adds $20 million of debt service per year, that $20 million goes on top of $43 million.
Correct.
So that's the
total cost
perspective
gotta be
you
there.
got to deal with.
That's correct.
It's not going to be an easy deal.
Right.
And,
Thank you.
and there'll be opportunities in that conversation then to talk about alternatives to
Yeah.
simply increasing current debt capacity.
Any other questions or concerns? Ms. Weems?
Yeah, as we've entered the one-to-one technological age, do we have any policy or any discussion about division-wide if there's a guideline or a policy that says how much screen time a student is having? Because if you go to different, like last year I went to 5 different elementary schools and it varied from not much to all day long on the screen. Again, I was just talking, according to the students that I was talking to, and research shows that might not be the best thing now. So I was just wondering if we have any sort of policy that says.
No, the board does not have a policy around that. We have curriculum that is a balanced curriculum. That's a clear balance if you look at the curriculum between students working on technology, students working on manipulative, students working one-on-one in small groups with the teacher, which is never technology-based. And so I don't think our curriculum would be we're not handing the learning over to the computer. So if there are scenarios where students are on there all day long, that would be a really more of an implementation challenge for that teacher or that school that we would want to address specifically. But there is not to your specific question, there's no board policy that says X number of minutes on screen, X number of minutes off screen. So there isn't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So moving along, next on our agenda is the third quarter.
Yes, so we do have the quarterly forecast, which I passed out earlier. Everybody should have a copy. This is for the third quarter, which is the spring quarter, January, February, March. It's winter quarter into the early spring.
Right.
Excuse me.
It just got stapled on the right corner.
Yes, it's stapled a little funky, but the pages are numbered at the bottom. So, again, the first January meeting is your organizational meeting, so we typically will not have a workshop at that meeting. You will hear from auditors at that meeting as an information item. And moving on forward into January on page 2, we'll have an update for you on the school improvement process and plan for continuous improvement, as well as we intend to bring you an update. You heard a little bit tonight about the Blue Ribbon Panel and the work that's happening there. And we feel like in second meeting in January, we'll be able to bring you an update on how that work is progressing. You'll also remember that the board included money in its reversion resolution for school safety to address some of the panel recommendations, and so we'll be bringing you the plan for spending on that as well at the January meeting. And you can look over there and see the action and consent items that we have. We also have, of course, a lot of this quarter is going to be budget, and so you'll notice as we move through into February, we have a special meeting, presentation of the estimate of needs and CIP. We have then a series of workshops related to that. You'll also have a Compass to 2020 mid-year update embedded in the first February meeting. Second February meeting, you'll have the budget ongoing workshop, and then you'll also have a report from the Board Code of Ethics Ad Hoc Committee. We will have our next public hearing on the budget in that February meeting, and then of course we'll have to have a special meeting for the board to adopt the budget in advance of the city council's deadline for us to submit that to them. We do intend to bring you, after the budget conversations, an update on the expansion of pre-day kindergarten and full-day kindergarten programs as we head into the last year of expansion on that with the current funding, and then an update on social and emotional learning and what's happening with that. We talked about that with the board in the last year, and we want to come back and talk with you about that again and tell you where we are. And then, as hard as it is to believe, at the end of this third page, Joel will be back talking about what happened during the session. and then we'll move on from there. So any questions about that? And a reminder, so this is it's sort of a first draft for you. If there's something that's not in there that you'd like to see, we will bring it back. I think I noted to you all in an email yesterday that we do want to bring a workshop back to you after we have a study group convene around recess. I know some of you have heard about that. Will fall somewhere in this time frame, but we're not sure yet. We haven't established the timeline on that, so that's why you don't see it on the sheet.
So I think the work of the Code of Ethics Committee is, I don't know if we're meeting yet. Dan, do you think we'll?
No.
I think we're done.
I think it'll be on the info agenda for the
So,
organizational meeting, and hopefully approve it on the 22nd.
Okay, so we'll shift that.
okay.
If that's
So information on the 8th?
Oh, well, wait a minute, we can do it on the 11th. We can do it,
No, that's today.
No,
Oh.
it is today.
That is
It's gone.
We won't see you again.
Oh,
before
that's
January.
right. We only have.
If we
Yeah,
wanted,
we
if we
won't
wanted
We
to,
only have one meeting.
right, if
That's
we wanted,
right.
to, if we wanted to workshop information and consent, then it would be workshop on
Right.
the 8th, information the 22nd.
I think we.
But we can't workshop it, but we can certainly put it on information for the 8th,
And,
correct?
Yeah.
Well,
We don't want to get absorbed in it at the retreat, but that would
that's right.
technically
Yeah.
be when we might approve it.
I'm gonna go out 8:03.
Well, it's not gonna, the retreat is gonna be here, and then we're
Right.
gonna have a regular meeting that evening here. So it's really not, it'll be,
so they want that just as part of the retreat and then have it on information on the 12th?
on the 12th.
February.
I mean, looking at the meeting schedule, that's the next meeting after the retreat.
Well, why couldn't we have it as information as part of the 8th?
Good.
You don't want to workshop it?
I don't know. You all feel we need to workshop it? It's up to your committee.
I don't think we need.
I don't think we need to either. Put it out there, talk about it,
That's, you know, when
tweak it off of info and bring it up and vote.
Okay.
So
So we
information on the
will
8th?
move it to information on the 8th. Okay.
and then action on the 22nd.
Sounds good.
Want to make sure we have that mapped out.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, we're hitting that hard stop time, not to time keep for you, but in the interim, if there's something missing and you look at it later and like, oh, I wanted that on there, please reach out and let me know. And
Okay.
we'll make sure we get it on.
So we're finished now? We can,
That's it from us.
we will head to the dais, and don't forget that we're sitting in kind of different positions, so look for where your name is when you go up there. Okay,
So you wanna adjourn?
15
I
minutes.
will adjourn this workshop and reconvene at
4:45.
4:45 for swearing in ceremony. This meeting of the School Board of the City of Virginia Beach is now in session. Okay. This meeting of the School Board of the City of Virginia Beach is now in session. Dr. Spence?
Good afternoon. So I'm Aaron Spence, Superintendent of Virginia Beach City Public Schools, and I would like to welcome all of you to this swearing-in ceremony for school board members who were recently re-elected or newly elected to serve a 4-year term commencing January 1st, 2019. Before we begin with the proceedings, I would like to take a moment to recognize Ashley McLeod, who will be departing our school board at the end of the month to resume the personal life she placed on hold to serve this community. If you will please join me in thanking her for her dedicated and extraordinary service. Joining me here on the dais are members of our current school board who will continue to serve for at least the next 2 years. On my right, we have Mr. Dan Edwards. To his right, Mrs. Beverly Anderson and Mrs. Victoria Manning. And on my left, we have Mr. Joel McDonald and Mr. Nace Riggs. Please join me in thanking them for their continued commitment. This afternoon, we are honored to have Virginia Beach Circuit Court Clerk Tina Sennen here to administer the oath of office to our re-elected and newly elected school board members who will continue or begin their journey January 1st, 2019. Ms. Sennen, would you please come forward? So for those of you in the audience who are here for this, now might be a good time to get your cameras ready. And without further ado, Mrs. Carolyn D. Weems, would you please step forward to be sworn in? And once completed, please take a seat behind your nameplate on the dais. Mrs. Weems was elected to the school board initially as an at-large representative in July 2002, before being selected to represent the Bayside District in December 2009, and once again re-elected to continue that service.
Do you, Carolyn D. Williams, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach, District 4 Bayside, for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God? I do.
Mrs. Dorothy M. Holtz, would you please come forward? Mrs. Holtz has been re-elected to continue to serve as one of 4 at-large members, a position she has occupied since January of 2011.
Raise your right hand. Do you, Dorothy M. Holt, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach at large for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God? I do.
Mrs. Sharon R. Felton, would you please step forward? Mrs. Felton was first elected to serve as the Beach District Representative beginning January 2015 and has been re-elected to continue serving as that representative.
Do you, Sharon R. Felton, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach, District 6 Beach, for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God? I will.
Mrs. Kimberly A. Melnick, would you please step forward? Mrs. Melnick has been re-elected to serve as the Princess Anne District Representative, a seat she has occupied since January of 2015.
Do you, Kimberly A. Melnick, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach, District 7, Princess Anne, for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God.
Mrs. Carolyn T. Rye, would you please step forward? Mrs. Rye has been re-elected to continue serving as the Lynn Haven District Representative, a seat she has also held since January of 2015.
Raise your right hand. Do you, Carolyn T. Rye, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach, District 5, Lynn Haven, for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God. Very well. Congratulations.
Let's take just a moment to congratulate all 5 of these re-elected members of our school board. And I would now like to introduce and welcome the newest member of our school board, Mrs. Laura K. Hughes. Would you please step forward? Mrs. Hughes has been newly elected to serve as one of the school board's 4 at-large members.
Do you, Laura K. Hughes, solemnly swear or affirm that you will support the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that you will faithfully and impartially discharge all the duties incumbent upon you as a member of the school board of the City of Virginia Beach at large for a term beginning January 1, 2019, and ending December 31st, 2022, according to the best of your ability, so help you God.
This concludes the ceremonial swearing in. However, the mission remains constant to continue our work in partnership with the entire community to empower every student to become a lifelong learner who is a responsible, productive, and engaging citizen within the global community. We thank each and every one of you for joining us and making a difference for every student every day. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you your school board of the City of Virginia Beach as of January 1st, 2019. Congratulations. Madam Chair, if you'd like to recess us before our formal meeting.
We will recess and reconvene here on the dais. We will recess and reconvene here on the dais at 6 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you.